Sweet dreams, real dreams, we hate when it's ending. Feels good outside of reality, this time we spending. But their alarms blaring, it's time to wake us up. Sunshine, he poured me in your cup, so I'm hot and uncomfortable. We ain't lukewarm, here you gotta sip it slow. It's gonna burn.
Welcome to the Ready Brew. My name's T Edge, and here, conversations always welcome, as we try to use a little bit of biblical, a little bit of historical, and a little bit of DNA to try to get us back to center. But at any rate, I want to say first, thank you all for coming back and giving us a try, or giving us another shot. Man, the last stream was terrible. I had to go back in and rejigger some settings. And so I feel like it's only fair that I try to redo this presentation, because I believe that the information that is in this presentation is very, very important, and it's something that we all need to know. It doesn't matter whether you're black, you're white, or brown, or yellow, or whatever color. This information is something that we need to know. You know, they always say that history that is not known is doomed to repeat itself. So I think this is a good lesson, a few good things to look into to kind of, find out where we are, where we've come from, and that type of thing. So, without further ado, what I want to talk about tonight is the Nolan Wells case. Now, we all have seen in Mississippi that there have been a number of, how can I say, sketchy events around the loss of life for black and brown people. Not only Mississippi, but also other areas, particularly in the South. I remember when I was about 15 years ago, or however long it was, we went to New Orleans. One of our, well, I'm sorry, my pastor at the time had a relationship with one of the pastors in New Orleans, and their church had been affected by the flood. And so we did a little mission trip, a little encouragement, a little fellowship, that type of thing. And going around town, speaking with some of the locals, they talked about how they had friends and family members who didn't get on a bus, who just went missing, never were found. They know they weren't affected by the flood waters because they talked to them after everything had started clearing up. Well, at least when everybody was trying to get out. And they believed that it was a case of people pretending to be friendly, offering assistance, and then taking them and taking their life away from them. So in this Mississippi, Louisiana area, things are a little touchy. And tonight, as we've been discussing since July 4th, I want to touch on the case of Nolan Wells because there are some things with this Nolan Wells case that, or not necessarily with the case, but surrounding the case, underneath the case, that I think is worth looking into.
We do want to continue on with some of our top stories that we're following from this week. Taking you out to this, we have an update in a case that is really capturing attention all across the country. We do know that as of this weekend, the official autopsy in the death of Nolan Wells has been completed, according to officials who are familiar with that investigation. Results from the state medical examiner's office have not yet been made public, but are expected to be sent to a grand jury. This all has to do with the early July death of Nolan Wells, an 18-year-old who was on a boat on Horn Island before he effectively went missing. Days later, his body surfacing. And still so many questions as we are continuing on in the days and weeks to follow his death. And to talk a little bit more about what we're watching here, I'd like to bring in Adante Pointer, civil rights attorney. Adante, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And once again, I'm getting a lot of text, emails, and even people reaching out to me on social media asking questions about this case. And so since we have the time to speak with you right now, I want to start with some of the basics. There have been a lot of conversations around these autopsy reports. There's an official one from the state, but also the family has gone on their own path to produce an independent autopsy. What has sort of been revealed through these reports? Again, the official one has not yet been released yet, but what's the difference between the two and why are they important to figuring out what ultimately happened to Nolan Wells?
Sure. The state autopsy is conducted first because the state actually had custody of Nolan's body way before the family got their hands on the body and were able to send it to an independent autopsy for an independent autopsy. So what you have is the state actually had the body in its most original state from once it was recovered. And so they have the primary opportunity and duty to investigate and examine this body for any type of signs of trauma or drowning and any other type of physical injuries or the condition of the body. Whereas an independent examiner, they're getting the body after the original autopsy is done. And oftentimes the body, as once again, during the autopsy, is cut open. Not only is the external body examined, but also the internal body is examined, as well as toxicology tests of the sort to see if there are any type of intoxicants on board, alcohol and things of that nature. So the independent autopsy is a way for a family to get answers in advance of the state's autopsy coming out. And oftentimes that's all the family has, because the state autopsies oftentimes take much longer to deliver the results to the family. And as you can imagine, if you're a family, you're anxious to know what happened to your son.
Absolutely. And so we do know from Ben Crump, he's the attorney who's currently working there with the family. They've been very outspoken about what they believe happened to their son and just really wanting to know more answers from those officials who are in charge of this investigation. But so far, as we've been talking about that independent autopsy, we do know that the family released some information indicating this. They said publicly that the determined and cause and manner of death is undetermined pending investigation. Legally, what does undetermined mean, and why might this information that this independent autopsy brings also be able to be reconciled with what the state has in order to put together the real pieces of what happened to Nolan Wells?
All right. Well, the independent autopsy and the person who conducted it, forensic examiner, was unable to reach a final conclusion about the cause of death. Why? Because they were missing significant parts of Nolan Wells' body, in particular his larynx and his throat, which may lead to evidence, or maybe evidence towards saying that he was choked or asphyxiated or things of that nature, or also that he took on water and he drowned, because that was the initial story that was put out, and that was what officials suspected, or at least they said they suspected, was that he drowned. And so not having the throat, which could be evidence of maybe some foul play, is super important. And without really fully examining the body, a forensic examiner cannot rule out or rule in a particular cause of death. So that's critical for the family to get that information.
And so, Dante, I want to ask you this. We've seen several videos that have surfaced online. TMZ, who's some of our partners here at Fox, they have obtained video of some of the moments where Nolan Wells was last seen there on the island. He's there on several boats. He seems to be with a crowd of people. So my question for you is about witnesses and the story that they'll be able to tell in order to help move along in this investigation. How critical are some of those eye accounts of people who are there on Horn Island to get together the pieces that really determine Nolan Wells' last few hours as he was alive?
Witness accounts and their statements are critical. They are actually very pivotal to trying to piece together what took place, because the witnesses have essentially firsthand information as to what took place, who was involved, and how this whole thing came to be. And also, you can use those witness accounts to either undermine or contradict, or to further probe into what maybe some of the initial statements were made by his friends who actually sailed out to Horn Island with him and ultimately left him. At least their claims are that they left him on Horn Island. So it's going to be critical to interview each and every one of those witnesses, no matter when they saw Nolan, or if it was before or after his friends left, because that's going to determine the circumstances, the mind state he was in, whether there was any type of arguments, any type of disagreements, whether they saw him with the phone, because as we know, the phone made it back to Mississippi and onto land, whereas Nolan supposedly left. I should say Nolan stayed and did not take the boat ride back with his friends. And that, I think most people would find that pretty odd, that a person would leave their would leave their phone and not have it with them while they plan to stay behind and let their friends go on about their business for the day. That's just a little odd, an odd fact here that I'm sure the family is, really trying to get to the bottom of.
And I guess especially in this day and age, especially with Gen Z and the younger generations, they're attached to their phones. And so I'm glad you brought up the phone piece of information, because we do know that Ben Crump and their legal team are right now searching for more information through all of the phones of people who were present at the time. How critical is that forensic evidence there and digital evidence of communications of those who were with Nolan within his last few hours, and what potentially stories could be told through those messaging and communications?
Well, our phone is essentially digital evidence. There are digital footprints, because everywhere you go is tracked. And so you're able to kind of recreate where people were at by the GPS coordinates and where the phone was located at particular times. And you're also able to determine the type of communication that was given. For example, you could send a text message. Maybe it was in reference to Nolan. Maybe it was in reference to the circumstances that were going on. And so that would allow investigators to kind of recreate the timeline of what took place. But it also can lead to either excluding or ruling someone out as having been involved in this, but also can rule in someone as being involved in the circumstances as to how he wound up coming up dead. So our phones are critical, and analyzing them is very important for police investigators. And keep in mind, Just because you delete something on your phone doesn't mean that it's deleted forever or that it can't be retrieved by investigators. So if by chance any of these phones have communications, text messages, social media, and things like that, investigators are still able to uncover those and review those to determine what happened to Nolan Wells.
And lastly here, Adante, I want to talk about the path forward. What other milestones are you really looking for? We know that evidence that was procured there from the official autopsy will be presented to a grand jury. What else are we watching for in the next few days and weeks as the details are continuing to seep out from Nolan Wells' case?
Well, certainly we're going to be looking at the information that comes from the cell phones. Certainly we're going to be looking to hear any other witness accounts in terms of how this all came to be and where people are at in a timeline. One of the other important things, too, is going to be those grand jury proceedings because heretofore, up till now, we really don't know what the state has gathered. They've been tight-lipped, as they often are in these type of investigations, in order not to tip off any particular witnesses or suspects, and also just to protect the integrity of the investigation. But when you're a family member, you're not so much interested in the tight-lippedness or keeping everything shrouded in secrecy. What you want is transparency. What you want is information. And you don't want it now. You want it like yesterday. Because at the end of the day, you have a parents and you have a family that is without an 18-year-old healthy young man who had all the promise in his life in front of him. And now the family is left with a void and they're entitled to everything that they have in their and that the state has and has accumulated in order to figure out what happened to Nolan Wells on that day.
Absolutely. And so we'll continue to keep folks updated here on Live Now from Fox as new information comes out. Certainly appreciate you, Adante, for joining us here on this Sunday to give us the latest information.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to continuing as we work on this case.
Absolutely.
So this is julianfreedom.org. Let's see, because we got too much going on over here. I need to find out what's happening. All right, let's see. Is this a little bit better for us? Let's give it a second. See if things catch up here. All right. Now we're supposed to be in good shape. I tested a lot earlier today to make sure that I had all my settings together. So I really don't know what's happening right now, but hopefully we can get this thing under control and get it running like it's supposed to. Okay. So here we see the story of Jill Jefferson. I come from a place in rural Mississippi where Wi-Fi didn't exist. I learned about work from cleaning houses and picking peas with my grandmother and aunt. We were maids. I learned about death when my Uncle Pud, celebrating his birthday, gave cake to 3 bone bear horses, only to find them dead the next day. He said they must have had diabetes. I learned about life when an old stray dog trot back up the road every single week after coming dropped it off somewhere. So the whole thing here. This is julianfreedom.org. The founder, Jill Colin Jefferson. She's a Harvard-trained lawyer and run-of-the-mill little organization or what have you. But I wanted you to see the site because this site does have a lot of good information. And I'm not going to go through everything here, but I wanted to show this because there are some other things from the site that I want to look at quickly here. This right here is the Crimson Report. Let's see if this is going to let me interact with it here. Because if not, I'm just going to have to. All right. No need to feel any type of way. These types of things do happen, unfortunately. So we're just gonna lean with it, rock with it. That's all we can do. Lean with it, rock with it. All right. So let's see. I have a. All right, let's get to this Crimson Report. Nope, this isn't it. Hold on. We're going to come back to this, but this isn't what I want to look at right now. All right, this is the Crimson Report. It says the Crimson Record. I'm sorry, the Crimson Record is a 7-state modern-day lynching report that covers the year 2000 to 2025. So it covers 7 different states from 2000 to 2025. So as you can see, it's very, very detailed. Excuse me. There are 222 total slides here. It's a very, very thorough report, a thorough record. But since we're discussing Mississippi, I want to deal with Mississippi, and I want to read this this little excerpt here, because there's a larger section further down in the record, but I want to read this section here. It says, in Mississippi, modern-day lynchings have steadily increased since 2021, with multiple incidents each year and a record number of cases in 2024. Mississippi's trend reflects a broader national rise in bias-linked deaths. Mississippi also has a pattern of inmate deaths in prison. For example, in 2020, there were 26 deaths in 2 months at Mississippi prisons. Mississippi accounts for the highest number of modern-day lynchings, with 19 cases identified, continuing an historic record. Julian also identified a disturbing pattern in Rankin County, Mississippi. Black men would often go missing around the same date and place every couple of years. Rankin County is known for its racism, brutality, and sundown towns. Mississippi also has the longest pattern of misclassified modern-day lynchings and subpar investigations. This is due in part to low job requirements. For example, to be a coroner in Mississippi, one need only obtain a high school diploma or equivalent and pass a test. So when we're discussing modern day lynchings, well, when we're discussing this Nolan Wells case, I know directly we're not dealing with what looks like a modern day lynching, not on its face, because we're talking about a young man who went on a beach party with a group of his friends, and he ended up passing away. No one knows the circumstances surrounding his death. We are starting to find or hear things that are possible clues that could tell us a story, but we can't jump to conclusions yet because we have to allow the authorities to do what they're going to do. Now, Whether you have faith in what they're going to do, that's an entirely different thing. But for the most part, we have to allow for the authorities to do what they're going to do. So, on its face, Nolan Wells' passing is not a modern day lynching. But in the interim, on the back end of what has happened, we are seeing what looks like a cover up. And I want us to understand that this cover up that we're seeing is nothing new. In fact, I want you to understand that this is the foundation of America. In fact, this founding goes back long before America. So I want us to go. Well, no, let's go here first. Let's go right here first. So, when it comes to Mississippi, when it comes to what we're seeing happening with young Mr. Wells, we have to know that Mississippi has a history. Mississippi comes from, or has its origins within the state of Louisiana. Now, the territory of Louisiana was quite large at one point. It was founded, if memory serves me correctly, in 1699, and there was later a purchase that was done, and it divvied up this territory of Louisiana. You have places in Ohio, Maine, the state of Maine. You have Louisiana, Mississippi, and a couple other places and territories, including St. Louis, Missouri, or Missouri, if I'm not mistaken. But in all regards, there's something to be said about the establishment of Louisiana, and it has a very, very historical connotation that a lot of people aren't aware of. I wasn't even aware of it, but I'm a curious person and I go digging into things. And one thing about Louisiana, and Louisiana specifically, there's a capital of Louisiana called New Orleans. We know that the French established Louisiana, and in France, there's a city named Orleans. But I want you to understand that Orleans, or France in particular, was a place that had a lot of Jews back in the day. Now, you will know that I believe that the descendants of slaves in the diaspora are descendants of the Hebrew people of Scripture. Now, that's just as a record here, just for the record. I'm not saying that Ashkenazi Jews are not Jews. I'm just saying that the blacks or African Americans, the Negroes, descend from the Hebrews of Scripture. Now, the reason I say that is because there are a lot of writings out there. And there's one writing in particular that that I would like to look into. This book is called The History of the Jews from the War with Rome to the Present Time. Now, one thing that I can say without question, without giving it any thought, is that this book is filled with a lot of horror stories. And I don't use that term lightly, because a lot of the things in this book are very they're very terroristic stories. So I wanted to go into this book and I wanted to take a look to see if there was any notice or any particular instance of the Jews and their relationship with the French people. So when I got in here, I noticed that there were a few different excerpts that named France specifically. As you see right here, it says 1100 to 1200, the Crusades, Jews in France, Spain, Germany, and Hungary. So let's go and read what kind of relationship the Jews had with the French. And we're just going to read about France. We're not going to go into Spain, Germany, and Hungary. So once we get to the end of the section with France, we're going to go and see what else we can find. So it says, death to the infidel. It is the will of God. Such was the cry that rang through Europe. Death to the Moslem, whose unhallowed shrine overshadows the holy place in which the Savior himself has worshipped, whose blasphemies awake the same echoes with his divine preaching once called forth. So right there, I want to stop real quick and just make a note. I want us to make a note that the Muslims were also in Europe in the period from 1100 to 1200, or the 12th through the 13th centuries. I mean, longer than that, but just in this reading. So it says, yes, but were these the only shrines where false worship was offered? Were they in Jerusalem the only ones who blasphemed the Lord? If the slaughter of the unbelieving Turk was acceptable to the Most High, why not that of the unbelieving Jew? It was strange that this peril should not have been dreaded by the Jews dwelling in lands which the mania called forth by Peter the hermit overspread. But it does not seem to have done so. They made no attempt to escape from the approaching danger. They even continued the ordinary course of their business, making the same enormous gains out of the Crusaders' necessities, which they had done out of every other political movement for generations past. So the Jews were doing their business and they were loaning money to the Crusaders. Now, on the surface, when you read this, because of the times that we're in, we immediately think Ashkenazi Jews. But I'm going to read something later that tells us that these particular sect of Jews that they're discussing here are not the Ashkenazi Jews. It says, the great baron who had vowed to lead his hundreds, or it might be his thousands, of armed followers to the rescue of the Holy Sepulchre, mortgaged his lands or his jewels, or perhaps sold them outright to the Jews, on such terms as we can hardly believe that the one could have asked or the other agreed to. Poor men parted with their all on the like terms. But that there were some shrewd men left among the Christians who were not carried away by the tide of popular excitement, the whole wealth of the community would have passed into the hands of the Jews. It is needless to add that the bitter feelings toward this isolated race, who were forever battening on the wants and sufferings of others, were greatly aggravated by these proceedings. And it was not long before this burst out into a flame. All over northern France and Germany, the Jews seem to have been numerous at this time. But in what is now Rhenish Prussia, and along the banks of the Moselle, they were to be found in the greatest abundance. It was near the city of Treves that the first vast multitude of undiscipled fanatics assembled, under the leadership of Walther von Heibenacht and Peter the Hermit. As they set forth under the guidance of a goat and a goose to find their way to the Holy Land, a cry was suddenly raised, doubtless by some enemy of the Jews, that while they were marching to destroy the enemies of the Lord Jesus in Palestine, they were leaving unassailed at home those who were not only his enemies, but his murderers, the Jews. The cry was instantly caught up. The fanatic crowd rushed into Treves and began a general pillage of the Jews' houses and a massacre of their occupants. Taken by surprise, the authorities offered no interference. Indeed, no interference they could have afforded. No interference they could have offered would have been of the slightest avail. The unhappy Jews, equally unprepared, could neither resist nor escape. Scenes too shocking for description ensued. Women tied heavy weights round their necks and threw themselves in the river to avoid the last dishonor. Men slew their own children to save them from the tortures to which they would be subjected. Their own lives they yielded up in despairing silence. Some fled to the citadel, hoping to be protected against the violence of their assailants. But the Bishop of Treves received them with threats and reproaches, refusing to interfere in their behalf unless they would accept baptism. You got to be a cold person to say you either get baptized or die. But that was the nature of how things were back in these times. So this is just something for people to see. You know, a lot of people say religion is fake, but history is built on religion. Most of our most prominent wars and migrations and those types of things, everything was tied to religion. But because it's not something that we learn, because we live in a Protestant society, it's not something that comes to mind or to the forefront. But let's continue here. The same scenes took place in Cologne, Worms, Spires, and Mayence. Everywhere, the only hope of escape from the torture and death was baptism, except, indeed, where a heavy bribe had been paid for episcopal protection, or where, as at Spires, the Jews armed themselves and sold their lives dearly. The tide of murder rolled on, sweeping the shores of the Main and the Danube, and the same scenes being everywhere repeated. In Bavaria, it is said that as many as 12,000 Jews were slaughtered. The Emperor Henry IV seems to have been the only potentate whom these atrocities struck with horror. He issued a decree repairing, so far as was possible, the wrongs that had been done and forbidding them for the future. But for the most part, the historians of those times relate the horrors that took place with the Segfreud, which speaks volumes as to the light in which they were regarded by those who witnessed them. But the three mighty hosts, led by Peter and his two colleagues, passed on and perished, and the exhaustion succeeded which such a drain on the population must necessarily occasion. It was not until half the 12th century had passed away that the crusading mania was again roused. Then a fanatic monk named Rodolph, commenced a mission through the German cities, calling on all men by the watchword Hep Hep, the initials of the words Hieroslima es Perdita, to assist in slaying and crushing the enemies of God. So just remember this. A fanatic monk named Rodolph commenced the mission through German cities, calling all men by the watchword Hep Hep. The Jews knew too well by past experience that they were included under this latter term, and many effected a timely retreat. Nevertheless, a frightful carnage took place in Strasbourg, Mainz, and the other Rhine cities, encouraged unhappily by too many of the clergy. So this carnage was encouraged by the clergy. This carnage was encouraged by the leadership of the church. It is like a bright gleam of sunshine on a dark November day to read the protest addressed by the saintly Bernard of Clairvaux to his brother clergy against the blind and savage spirit by which Rodolph was possessed. The Jews, he writes, ought not to be persecuted. They ought not to be put to death. They ought not to be driven into banishment. What says the scripture? Slay them not, lest my people forget. The Jews are living monuments to remind us of the sufferings of the Lord. Therefore it is that they are scattered. Therefore, they endure hard bondage under Christian princes. Yet, in the eventide of the world, they will be converted, and he will remember them. Addressing Rodolph himself, he says, "You are of another mind from him who said, Put up thy sword into the sheath. For he that taketh the sword shall perish with the sword." Does not the church triumph more gloriously over the Jews when when she refutes and converts them, than if she slew them with the edge of the sword? It is satisfactory also to learn that Pope Eugenius III advocated the same view, and that Rodolph was ordered back to his convent, though not before he had occasioned the most terrible crimes and sufferings. So here is the acknowledgement that the Jews were suffering under the bondage of the church in the 1100s. This was, it says, half of the 12th century, so around 1150. He says, the Jews are living monuments to remind us of the sufferings of the Lord. Let me see. Slay them not, lest my people forget. So this again is not, I know we hear in our times these brothers who call themselves Hebrew Israelites preaching about remembering, about the Jews remembering who they are. And here we see it in this book. It says, slay them not, lest my people forget. So there's a remembering that is supposed to take place. It says, either in the eventide of the world, they will be converted and he will remember them. But not after this Rodolph guy had occasioned the most terrible crimes and suffering. So there was a lot of crimes and suffering committed by the church, admittedly. And this is in the country of France now. This is just France by itself. It says, but the condition of the Jews grew no better, but rather worse, as a century advanced. The calumny, whether it was the revival of an ancient accusation against the Jews or the newly invented at this period of crucifying boys at their Passover in mockery of the Savior's passion, was widely diffused and discredited. Was widely diffused and credited. It was reported that about AD 1180, during the youth of Philip Augustus, they had in this manner murdered one Richard, a youth belonging to Pontius. And in confirmation of the truth of the story, the body, when it was conveyed to Paris, worked many miracles. Philip had no sooner ascended his throne than he put forth an edict. AD 1182, whereby all debts due to Jews were annulled, and all pledges held by them were to be restored to the original owners. Not satisfied with this display of somewhat cheap generosity, he made a second proclamation, confiscating all their property which was not removable, and commanding them to sell everything else belonging to them and depart from his dominions. In vain they appealed for mercy. King and nobles and bishops alike closed their ears. The twofold offense of holding heretical opinions and mortgages on the states was not to be forgiven. It will readily be credited that at the enforced sale of their goods, the prices bidden were of the lowest. The unhappy Jews were compelled to depart amid the execrations of the populace from the homes in which their whole lives had been passed, carrying with them little but their wives and children. It was not enough that they had been by the most high-handed injustice stripped of their possessions. They were not to be allowed to remain in the land where the wrong had been done, and so remind the doers of their crime. So they had to they had all their things confiscated, and then the only thing they could leave with were their wives and children. So tell me how a population starts off poor when they migrate to another land, because they can't take money or any effects with them. But in this case, it will surprise no one to be told that their removal did not increase the wealth or relieve the public burdens of the nation. It was found that the expulsion of the Jews was, as Fauci said of the murder of the Duke Dang Hein, more than a crime, for it was a blunder. Within 20 years, Philip found it necessary to issue a new edict permitting their return. But it does occasion our wonder to hear that the Jews consented to the step. It speaks volumes for the depth of the misery to which they had been reduced, that they could be prevailed on to trust themselves again to the justice and mercy of a king who had so flagrantly proved his disregard of both. Not long after their return, we are told that they held an assembly by permission of the queen's mother at a castle on the Seine. Here the old charge of scourging, crucifying, and crowning with thorns a youth whom they had seized was once more alleged against them. Philip repaired in person to the spot where he condemned 80 of the accused to be burned alive. In Spain during this century, the Jews were still equitably dealt with, though there were signs of the carnage of feeling towards them which was gradually taking possession of the public mind. For this two causes may be assigned. In the first place, the power of the Mohammedans, or the Muslims, who had always been the protectors of the Jews, was fast waning, and the Christian sovereigns no longer dreaded the enmity of the Jews, who in previous generations might have been dangerous allies to their rivals. In the second, the downfall of the Umayyad caliphs, who had uniformly been just and generous in their dealings with the Jews, proved most disastrous to them. The Almohades, apologies if I mispronounced that, who in AD 1150 superseded them, were fierce and bloody fanatics, inclined to force the faith of Islam on all with whom they came in contact. One of the first edicts of Abdel Mumin, the founder of the dynasty, required all his subjects of whatsoever creed to profess Mohammedanism. Now, I think this is a poignant statement, because we have a lot of black people in America and other places who believe that our national heritage was Muslim. They tell us all the time, or we have an understanding from history that we were the Moors in Europe. This tells us right here that it didn't matter what your faith was. It didn't matter what your race was. Everybody who was a subject had to become a Muslim. It said the usual consequences followed. Many Jews went into voluntary exile. Many more made an outward profession of their persecutors' creed, still secretly retaining their own. The happy days of the Spanish Jews were over. Moorish rule was ended. Excuse me. In the Christian kingdom, however, justice and right still prevailed. The royal authority was uniformly exerted for the protection of peaceable and unoffending men. But there were occasions on which this power proved insufficient to restrain the violence of the people, who had probably learned from their neighbors to regard the Jews with disfavor. Thus, a riot occurred at Toledo, AD 1108, instigated in all likelihood by the Crusaders, who were just on the point of setting out for Palestine. The populace, under the usual pretext of slaying the enemies of Christ, attacked and burned the houses of the Jews, wrecked the synagogues, immolating the rabbins, as it were, on their own altars, and made a general massacre of the common people. So the Crusaders didn't just destroy all their stuff, they burned the people on the altars. It's evil. Alfonso tried in vain first to repress and then to punish the offenders. But this occurrence, shocking as it was a mere temporary outburst of popular fury. It was not repeated, not even in the reign of his descendant Alfonso VIII in 1171, when above all other times a Jewish massacre might have been looked for. This king had been deeply enamored of a beautiful Jewess named Rachel Formosa. For her society was neglected. For her society, he neglected his king. For her society, he neglected his queen and withdrew himself from public business. Grave misfortunes ensued. His forces were defeated at Alakos, and the kingdom menaced by the hostility of the neighboring states. The people believed that these calamities were due not to the bad administration of the public affairs, but to the indignation of heaven at the king's unhallowed affection for a believer. The sea was also aroused favor shown circumstance. A rebellion out. The riders burst into the king's palace and assassinated Formosa before the eyes of her lover. But they satisfied themselves with her death, and did not molest favorites whom she had patronized. Alfonso IX showed even greater favor to the Jews than had been bestowed on them by his predecessors. Innocent III repeated in his instance the charge with Gregory VII held against him of elevating the synagogue at the cost of the church. He relieved both Jews from petty lives. How the rare privilege in those days. All the Jews ways convert Christianity to claim at the hand of the person who had converted him whatever enmity he might think proper. Seems to be as unfair to the Christians as the legislation of those times usually was to the Jews. So that was France. Oh, and I read Spain, so I went too far. But let's make it back to the top here. So that was the Jews' relationship in France in the 1100s and 1200s. Let's see what we can find about their relationship within France. Here. So you covered 100s through the 1200s. Let's see, there should be 1600 through 1400. We got the 1200s through the 1300s. All right, I'm buffering a little bit. Let's give it a little bit of time to get itself together here. I'm trying to see what we can do to get this thing to clear up so that it'll stop buffering, so that we can keep up here with the stream. All right, so hopefully what I just did there will get us what we need. I think we're gonna be in good shape. All right, I think we might be good to go. I think we might be good to go. No, not quite. Let's do this. All right. So hopefully this works. All right. I think we might be in good shape here. Looks like we've been going for about an hour. Try to go ahead and round this up because it's definitely not the goal to be here all night. But let's see. I'm trying to figure out what's got me slowing down over here because we shouldn't be slowing down over here. Give me a second. I'll be right back. See if we can right, I appreciate you. Let me try to get through that real quick. Then as soon as I jump back over here, we slow back down a little bit, but let's see what's going on, because this can't be life, man. All right. So we left off the Jews in France and Germany from 1200 to 1300. It says, in France, during the first quarter of the 13th century, no persecutions of the Jews were recorded. In the south, their condition appears to have been prosperous. They were protected by Raymond, the heretic but powerful Count of Toulouse. One of the bitterest charges made against them by Innocent III was that he employed and favored Jews. And when after his submission, he had to sign the conditions on which his offenses would be overlooked, one of them was that he should no longer employ Jewish officers. In 1223, Philip Augustus died and was succeeded by Louis VIII. Succeeded by Louis VIII, called, it is to be presumed in mockery, Louis the Lion. During his short reign of 3 years, we hear that he passed a decree annulling all future interest on debts incurred to Jews, and ordering the payment of the capital in 3 separate installments, each after the interval of a year. In 1226, Louis VIII died, and his son, the renowned Louis IX, known to history as St. Louis, succeeded to the throne. So St. Louis, Missouri is, I digress. He was at that time a minor, and France was under the regency of Blanche of Castile for nearly 10 years. Louis's first act seems to have been the annulling of 1/3 of all debts due to Jews, and an immunity from arrest or distraint for the 2 remaining portions. He also called a council at Milan on the Seine, which forbade Christian men for the future to borrow money from Jews on any terms. He is said to have issued this order for the good of his soul. Now this could be does not clearly appear. How this could be does not clearly appear. Possibly, he felt so strongly the power and the will of the Jews to use their money-lending facilities in an oppressive way that he sought in this way to prevent their injurious influence. Or he may have regarded the scriptural prohibitions addressed to the Jews against lending their money on usury to their own countrymen as applying to all loans on usury, though scripture expressly asserts otherwise. That this was so seems evident from the fact that Louis's enactment was leveled as much against the Lombards and Corsini, usurers, as against the Jews. It would seem that Louis wished to induce them to abandon usury for agriculture or handicraft, as was also the desire of his contemporary Edward I of England. But both monarchs failed in the attempt. In the state to which matters had now grown, it would have been next to impossible to abate the dislikes of the people to them so as to induce them to permit the Jews to engage in the work either of the artisan or the peasant. So they tried to talk the Jews into not being moneylenders, but to be agriculturalists and to do handiwork. It says, the hatred of the populace was in no way abated by the quiet of the last 40 years. In 1239, there were riots in Paris and Orleans and other great cities on the old charge of crucifying boys at the Passover. in which property was wrecked and wholesale murders took place. At Ploermel in Brittany, the Duke that country summoned as assembly of the nobles and bishops, at which it was declared that agriculture was ruined by the monstrous exactions of the Jews, and a series of laws were passed which for injustice and cruelty exceed any ever put forth in any country. It was decreed that all debts to Jews should be canceled, that all Jews should be banished from the country, that no person who should kill a Jew should be liable to persecution for it, and that no judge or magistrate should take cognizance of any such offense. A petition was further addressed to the King of France, requesting him to carry out the same regulations throughout his dominions. Let me read that again. A decree that all debts to Jews should be canceled, that all Jews should be banished from the country, that no person who should kill a Jew should be liable to persecution for it, to prosecution for it, and that no judge or magistrate should take cognizance of any such offense. A petition was passed, further addressed to the King of France, requesting him to carry out the same regulations throughout his dominions. So, again, this was in Ploermel in Brittany. They passed this law, and then after they passed the law, they signed a petition asking the King of France to carry out the exact same law throughout all the districts of France. It says the Council of Lyons, held in the ensuing year, required all Christian princes on pain of excommunication to force the Jews in their several territories to refund to the Crusaders the sums they had exacted from them. The Jews were forbidden to exact any debt from a Crusader's family until he himself returned from Palestine, or until satisfactory evidence of his death had been produced. Another council prohibited them from practicing as physicians, because being in direct league with Satan, if they did cure anyone, it would probably be by their master's aid. Whatever evils men experienced for which they were unable to assign any special cause were supposed to be due to the secret spells and diabolical influence of the Jews. Much as in succeeding generation, the same evils were attributed to witchcraft. The main source and center of their evil knowledge was supposed to be the mysterious and terrible Talmud. Edicts were issued for its destruction, and it was burned, we are told, by cartloads in the streets of Paris. Now we talked about a few weeks ago, if you want to go back and check, it was brief, but we talked about how the Talmud is where we learn that the Jews were taught to call the Europeans the descendants of Esau. And it wasn't because they were the natural descendants of Esau, but the Talmud taught them to equate the Europeans and Christians to Esau because of how cruel they treated them. So again, here we see another exaction of that cruelty, because they passed edicts to destroy all the Talmuds, and they burned the Talmuds by cartloads in the streets in Paris. Now, I'm not saying that anybody needs to go back and study the Talmud, because I don't even know if that's possible. I've read a couple passages, and I'll keep my opinions to myself, but I'm not telling anybody to go and make that an objective. But this is, this was the culture of the time. This was the holy book of the Jews. So it says, a considerable exodus seems to have followed on these measures, which was taken advantage of by the king, who seized on the goods of those who had taken flight, and thus raised money for the crusade on which he was about to enter. About the same time, he ordered them to wear a special badge called the ruel, a piece of blue cloth worn both on the front and on the back of the Jewish gabardine. Now, I'm assuming that's because some Jews did convert, but there were Jews who didn't convert or who refused to become Christian. Notwithstanding these severities, it is plain that Louis was actuated more by desire of converting the Jews to Christ than of venting his horror and hate of them. We read of a solemn conference held in the year 1254 between Rabbi Jekiel and a convert from Judaism named Nicholas before Blanche, who acted as regent during her son's absence. Both parties claimed the victory. Neither, consequently, underwent any conversion. It was probably disappointment at this result which induced Louis to send home orders that they should now be banished from the realm, which, we are told, the Queen Mother punctually executed. During Louis's absence occurred also the first rising of the shepherds, as it's called. This was led by an apostate Hungarian monk who had originally been a Mussulman. The avowed purpose was the rescue of King Louis from the hands of his enemies. They committed pillage and murder wherever they went, but the Jews were the especial objects of their violence. It is probable that if they had confined their outrages to them, they might have escaped punishment. But the massacre of the Christians could not be overlooked, especially of priests and friars. The Hungarian and his followers were overpowered and slain. Philip the Hardy succeeded to the throne in 1270, and one of his first acts was to recall the Jews to France. It having been discovered that however much the people might complain of their avarice and exactions, they got on considerably worse without them. It is said that during his reign, which lasted for 25 years, they continued unmolested and again gathered in great riches. They were banished, however, from Gascony in 1288 by Edward I of England, a preliminary measure, one might think, to his expulsion of them from his English domains. A story is told by Walsingham of his having taken this step in consequence of a miraculous escape which had from being struck dead by a flash of lightning, which passed directly over his bed and killed two of his chamberlains who were standing close by. As a sign of his gratitude for their deliverance, he is said to have banished the Jews. Edward was a man rather in advance of his days, and it is difficult to believe that he could have thought that the merciless banishments of the Jews would be a fit requital of the mercy shown to him. We shall see more of his motives in an ensuing chapter, but it is proper to remark that this age, apparently beyond any other, credited the most extravagant conception respecting the satanic hatred of the Jews for the Christian mysteries. They are continually charged with endeavoring to possess themselves of the sacred wafer, and then offering it the grossest insults, their sacrilege being as often exposed and punished by some special miracle. A woman is persuaded by a Jew to convey to him the consecrated host, which he stabs in several places whereon it bleeds profusely. And some Christian customers coming in see it and indict him for the offense. Or he puts the wafer into his purse, in which are a number of silver pieces, and these are turned into 7 wafers, similar to the one he had placed among them. Staggered by the miracle, he becomes a convert to the gospel. Stories like these are continually to be met with. That the mass of the people believe them is beyond dispute, but whether the more intelligent among the clergy attached any real faith to such tales or simply used them as a means of accomplishing their own ends and exciting popular fury against the Jews is a matter very difficult to determine. In 1285, Philip IV, called the Fair, the shameless murderer of the Knights Templars, succeeded his father. His first acts were extremely hostile to the church, but he showed no lenity to the Jews. 6 years after his accession, he repeated the act of several of his predecessors and expelled them from the kingdom. It does not appear that the banishment was rigidly enforced, as we find a second expulsion taking place not many years afterwards. In fact, these repeated sentences of exile and subsequent recall read very much as though they were simply regular stages in a prescribed system of spoliation. After the Jews had been resident in a country sufficient length of time to have amassed wealth enough to be worth seizing upon, it was discovered that they had been guilty of some terrible wickedness, which rendered it impossible for a Christian sovereign to tolerate them within its domains or dominions. They had seized some Christian boy, perhaps, and indulged their natural hate at once of the Savior and his worshippers. By subjecting him to the death on the cross, the fact that they had done so was made abundantly clear by some astounding miracle, which rendered human testimony needless. And I apologize, I'm a little heavy-tongued. It's a little late, but we're gonna get through this. We're gonna make it through this because I owe this to everyone because of last night's live. But it says the immediate authors of the deed were executed, and their property confiscated to the crown, and their countrymen were condemned to forfeit all but their movables, and with these to quit the realm. Sometimes the charge was varied, and they were found to have poisoned wells, or leagued with some foreign enemies, or, as we have seen, profaned and insulted the host. But it always came to the same result. The Jews were driven out of the land until they were in a condition to pay a large sum for readmission. And then the king, in the midst of his just anger, remembered mercy and allowed them to return and grow rich until their renewed wealth brought some fresh wickedness to light. So it's clear that even back then, getting rid of the Jews was hard to do because the economy always suffered. And one thing you hear about our community here in America is that our spending boosts our economy. So I think this is another thing that we should pay attention to. So that's France in the 1200s through the 1300s. Let's make our way back up here, and let's see what we can find out about the 1300s to the 1400s in France. Excuse me. Let's get here. So I think these stories are important to acknowledge because simply when it comes to understanding history and how history tends to repeat itself, it's important for us to see, it's important for us to see how things are not so far moved away from center as we think they are. We hear people always ask the question, why do these people hate us so much? What did we do to them? The only thing that we've done was not want to be slaves in this country. But you can see, we have a history with them. There's a marked history with them. And this is where their fear of allowing us to get up comes from. Because once we are up, we always get above them, even though we are the minority in their dominions. But I digress. Let me get here. So we got the Jews in France in 1300 through 1400. And I'm reading all of this because I want it to be seen. I want to show that this thing is not just a one-off. And I'm trying to bring all of this together because I want to tie all of this together to show where we are today in America. It says, the history of the Jews in France in the 13th century may be regarded as terminating with their second expulsion from that country by Philip the Fair. That king died in 1314 and was succeeded by Louis X, called in history Hutin or Mutin, the Turbulent. One of the first acts of the new king was to recall the Jews, who not only had experience nothing but harsh and contemptuous usage, but even to pay a heavy price for the privilege. Nothing gives a stronger idea of the utter helplessness and friendlessness of the Hebrew people at this period than the readiness with which they could accept any conditions whatever that seemed to promise them protection for the moment against violent or lawless outrage. A semblance of justice indeed was shown them. The synagogues were restored to them, and their worship again permitted. They recovered the privilege of burying their dead in their ancient graveyards. Nay, such debts as were still owing to them, the greater portion having been already paid over to the king, he had condescended to make himself their trustee. They were allowed to claim before the public tribunals, conditionally always on their paying 2/3 of it into the royal treasury. So in essence, this man said, give me 66% of y'all money, and y'all take the other 33, and we'll call it even. I think that's funny. I think that's a terrible exaction of fees to rob the people in that way. But again, history always repeats itself, because we see what seems like highway robbery going on right now in our government. But I digress. In the reign of Philip the Long, a few years afterwards, something like fairness and even mercy seems to have been shown them, possibly as a set-off to the king's exaction of 150,000 livres from them. They were allowed to lend on usury to certain persons and on certain conditions. They might acquire property and houses and land, and they were not required to wear their distinguishing badge while traveling from one town to another. About this time, AD 1319, a novel charge was preferred against them, and which we might believe to have been at least founded on fact, if it did not seem impossible that the Jews of those times could have been guilty of such suicidal rashness. At Lunel, they were accused of travestying the Savior's passion, not as the ordinary charge, but by the crucifixion of a Christian boy. But by carrying a crucifix in a public procession, reviling it as they went, dragging it through mire and filth, and heaping reproaches upon it. For this offense they were tried, convicted, and punished. Now, my whole life I've identified as a Christian. And I will admit there was a point in my life where the cross was sacred. But we can see now that this comes from a tradition that held earthly possessions in high esteem. When the scripture tells us not to make any graven images of anything in the earth, in the water, or in the sky. So we see the people that were claiming with everything they had to be the most chaste people, the most holy people. They were breaking commandments off the top, because they literally punish people for dragging a cross. But anyway, in 1321, a far more serious calamity befell them. It has been recorded that during the captivity in the east of Louis IX, a multitude of peasants assembled and declared themselves commissioned from on high to rescue their beloved sovereign from bondage. And they had evidenced their zeal in the cause of heaven by acts of barbarity towards the Jews. There was no king to be rescued now, but the Holy Land itself was in bondage, and there were vague prophecies current among them that it could be reconquered only by the mean and lowly. They were headed by a degraded priest and mendicant friar who affected special sanctity of life and claimed to work miracles in proof of their sacred mission. They were followed by large multitudes who ravaged the southern provinces of France, especially Languedoc, everywhere breaking open the prisons and swelling their ranks by enlisting the criminals whom they let loose. They spared their Christian fellow subjects as much as they could, but displayed the most relentless barbarity towards the Jews, whom they everywhere pillaged, outraged, and murdered. The Jews appealed to the Pope and to the king. The former issued an anathema against the insurgents, but it was altogether disregarded. The latter sent a few horsemen to their aid, who, however, were utterly powerless to help them. They fled in despair to the shelter of any fortified place which could refuse admittance to the shepherds. 500 found a refuge in a castle at Verdun on the Garonne, which the governor allowed them to occupy. Their enemies followed and besieged them. After a stout and desperate defense, finding themselves unable to hold out any longer, they threw some of their children over the wall, and then, as at Masada and at York, slew each other to a man. When the besiegers broke in, they found no living enemy. All over Languedoc, at Angoulême, and at Bordeaux, frightful massacres of Jews took place. The excuse alleged for them was that the plunder of the Jews was necessary to the armies of the Lord in order to equip them properly for the recovery of Palestine. But terrible as were their sufferings from the violence of the fanatics, what ensued was even more full of horror. The outbreak was followed, as might have been anticipated, by an epidemic pestilence, the natural result of scarcity of wholesome food and the corruption of so many human corpses. But the people, possessed as they were by the worst form of religious mania, were easily persuaded by their leaders that the malady was caused by the poisoning of wells and rivers, which again was the work of the Jews. The Sieur de Parthenay wrote word to the king that a great leper seized on his land had confessed to him that he had received from a rich Jew a consignment of drugs which were to be enclosed in bags and thrown into the wells. The king returned in alarm from Petois, which he had been visiting, and ordered that all lepers should be arrested and put to question. That is, examined by torture. This is the mode of inquiry elicited the usual results. The unhappy sufferers in their agony confessed everything of which they had been suspected, however monstrous and incredible it might be. It appeared that there had been a conspiracy between the infidel kings of Tunis and Granada, the Jews and the lepers, Satan himself presiding at the conference. Woe and misery were to be wrought on the Christians by the poisoning of water which they drank. The lepers were straightway ordered to be burned, pregnant women alone being spared, and they only until the time of their delivery. In the instance of the Jews, not even the mercy seems to have been shown. They were burned without distinction. At Shignon, a great trench was dug. Fires were kindled in it, and 160 Jews burned alive, men and women together. Many women with their children in their arms voluntarily threw themselves into the flames to escape baptism. In the royal prison at Victory, 40 Jews, who were persuaded that no mercy would be shown them, resolved to die by their own hands rather than by those of the uncircumcised. They therefore fixed upon one of their own number, an aged man greatly honored and beloved, and requested him to become their executioner. He consented to undertake the office with the help of a youth whom he chose for the purpose. When all but these two had been slain, the old man ordered the young man to kill him also, and he was obeyed. But the young man, lacking the resolution to take his own life, attempted to escape from the prison when he was taken prisoner and confessed what had taken place. In the midst of these horrors, Philip V died in AD 1322, and his successor, Charles IV, was pleased to pardon the hapless survivors of this bloody persecution, conditionally, however, on the payment of a large subsidy. When this had been received, the Jews were permitted to leave their prisons, gather together what they could of their effects, and leave the kingdom. It is evident, however, that the whole Hebrew population could not have acquitted the country, or if they did, they soon began to return unnoticed to it, for in 1348, when a second visitation of the same terrible disease once more desolated the land, we find that the old colony had renewed, and with the same merciless results, the sword of the law being let loose to slay those whom the pestilence had spared. Indeed, it is evident that notwithstanding their multiplied miseries and wrongs, the Jews were still anxious to obtain the permission of their persecutors to reside among them, for we find them in 1360 bargaining with King John, who had been defeated and captured by the Black Prince, to supply him with the means of paying the ransom due him conditionally on their being permitted to dwell in France without molestation for the space of 20 years. A Jew named Manasseh, or Manasseh as he was styled, conducted the bargain on the part of the Jews. The fee for admission to France was fixed at 14 florins for each adult. For children and servants, 1 florin. Similarly, the annual fee for continued residence was 7 florins and 1 florin. They were to be exempt from all taxes except land tax. They were to be allowed to hold landed property, build synagogues, and possess cemeteries, and to be exempted from baronial jurisdiction, being placed directly under that of the king himself. They were also exempted from what had been always felt by them a heavy burden, the necessity of listening to controversial sermons preached in hopes of converting them. It was not without difficulty that the regent afterwards, Charles V, called the wise and forced the observance of these conditions, as he seems to have done in all good faith. Not long after his accession, the clergy in Languedoc published a sentence of excommunication against all who should supply the Jews with fire, water, bread, or wine. It says, these people who supplied the Jews with fire, water, bread, or wine would be excommunicated. Meaning they couldn't quench their thirst. They couldn't give them food for their bellies. They couldn't even give them wine for any issues. Any wine was like a medicine. And they couldn't give them fire to stay warm. This was cruelty. But on receiving an appeal against this severity, the king issued his ordinance annulling the decree as being alike unjust to the Jews and dishonorable to the church. He twice renewed the compact with the Jews, once for 6 and once for 10 years, receiving for the renewal 3,000 gold livres. Again, I think it's important also to note that people couldn't get gold in Europe. Gold was not a European commodity. At that time, the furthest they were going was Palestine. Palestine wasn't an area that was known for gold. But we do know that West Africa, specifically along the Niger River, there was an abundance of gold. Even to this day, they're still harvesting, quote unquote, gold in this territory. So we know, or we have an idea of how the Jews kept getting wealthy. They would go and they would come back and they would have all this gold. 3,000 gold livres is a lot. It is evident that during this interval of repose, the wealth of the detested race had again accumulated. In 1378, they lent Charles 20,000 livres and engaged to provide him with 200 more every week. But the usual result followed. The people began to clamor at the heavy burdens laid upon them, which they declared were imposed only for the purpose of ministering to the greed and the luxury of the usurers. In September of 1380, Charles V died and was succeeded by his son, a minor, 12 years old. Soon after, a tumultuous outbreak took place in consequence of the regent. The Duke of Anjou, having confirmed the privilege granted the Jews by the late king, all classes joined in it. The nobles, who as usually were deeply indebted to the Hebrew usurers, called out for their expulsion from the country as the readiest mode of clearing themselves of their liabilities. The people, instigated probably by them, pillaged and destroyed the offices where the registers of debts were kept, and further gratified their enmity to the hateful race by plundering their houses of such valuables as they could lay their hands on, and by tearing their children from them and carrying them to churches where the clergy were always ready to baptize them. Now, Again, history always repeats itself. We've seen this thing happen time and time again. Whiteville, North Carolina, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Seneca, New York. I'm not Seneca. I forget. The park in New York. I can't remember the original name for it. But most vividly remarkable, Black Wall Street. During Black Wall Street, they ran into people's houses and they plundered everything they could take. It's even been reported by a first-hand account that they was going in, taking people's china. They were rolling the piano out the front door. They were taking things in this nation. We read that the same things happened years before in France. It says the people, instigated probably by them, pillaged and destroyed the offices where their registers of debts were kept, and further gratified their enmity to the hateful race by plundering their houses of such valuables as they could lay their hands on, and by tearing their children from them and carrying them to churches where the clergy were always ready to baptize them. And guess what else happened during Black Wall Street? The people who paid their insurance, their property insurance, they never got paid out. They were never able to rebuild their properties. They were never able to replace the stolen properties, the damaged property, the lives that were lost. This is a terrible understanding. Not understanding. A terrible reaccounting of history, and history repeating itself. It says the regent endeavored to suppress the disturbance. He issued a proclamation requiring all persons on pain of death to restore the spoil of which they had possessed themselves. But we are told that very few obeyed the order. The regent persisted, however, in the policy he had adopted. And during the earlier years of Charles VI's reign, the Jews were treated by the state with equity and mercy. But the evil lay too deep for any legislation to remedy. The distress of the country decreased, and with it the difficulty of obtaining money. There was but one class from which money could be obtained, the Jews, and they unwisely abused the power thus put into their hands. Regardless of the angry passions which they were rousing, they continued their ruinous rates of usury until about 14 years after the accession of Charles VI. Then the storm burst suddenly upon them, and they were once more commanded to quit the country. The step in question was taken in consequence of the condition into which the unfortunate young monarch had now sunk. His melancholy madness rendered him peculiarly liable to the influence of the clergy, who were forever representing to him the guilt of standing between an accursed people and the vengeance of the God whom they had offended. So these people thought that they were the hand of God, and that because God was offended, he was allowing them to do these things. It says the queen was won over to the side with that persecuting party. The clergy, the nobles, and the people already belonged to it. Nothing for a long time had stood between the Jews and the sentence of banishment. But the justice of the king, this barrier was now removed, and the blow fell heavily and suddenly. They were suffered to depart on milder terms than on previous occasions. Leave was given them to recover all debts due to them and to sell their property as advantageously as they could, but they were allowed only 1 month in which to wind up their affairs, and then they crossed for the last time the frontiers of France. So, again, that was France in the 1300s through the 1400s. We have one more that I want to cover, and I know that it's taking a long time, but again, I want to be as thorough about this as possible because I don't want to leave anything untouched, and there's some things that I want to pull together here at the end. So I appreciate you bearing with me here. Let us now turn to We see there's no other mention of the Jews the Jews in France until the 17 through the 1800s. So let's go and take a look to see about the Jews in France in the 1700s. Excuse me. Let's see. We're gonna go down to the section where it talks about France because I don't want to read the whole chapter. I just want to read about the Jews in France in particular. Okay, I think this is okay, here we are. Do I want to read this section? No. All right, turning to France in the 1300s through the in the 1700s through the 1800s. Turning to France, we find that the condition of the Jews during the 18th century was very peculiar. It has been mentioned in a previous chapter that although nominally excluded from France, they had long been suffered to dwell there under protections granted to them by Henry II and others. There were indeed 3 different sections of Jews resident in France at this time. The Portuguese Jews, to whom charters were granted by the French Parliament AD 1550. These were chiefly to be found in Bayonne, Bordeaux, and its vicinity. They appear at first to have passed under the name of New Christians, and as such, no doubt were obliged to submit themselves to the ordinances of the church. But in the fierce strife which ensued between the Catholics and the Huguenots, they escaped notice. So at this time, because the reformists were on the scene, who the Huguenots were, they were reformists of the Catholic Church. The Catholics were taken up into making sure that they were defending themselves against the reformists, so they didn't pay as much attention to the Jews at this time. It is said that they contracted marriages according to their own rights and evaded the baptism of their children. And this is the New Christians. So they converted to Christianity, but they weren't converting their children. They weren't making their children get baptized. There were again the Jews of Avignon, who were either Italians or native Frenchmen. These had been tolerated by the popes during their residence there, and probably no great notice had been taken of them since the removal of the papal court. Again, with the Italian Jews, a lot of people say, "Man, you're making a whole lot of fuss about Jews calling them black when they're white." But there are DNA papers out now that specifically show that Italy shows sub-Saharan African DNA within their population and within their Jewish population. So again, these things are being corroborated and pulled together not only by historical accounts, but also now by DNA accounts. Because we can read in the Bible about the different excursions and especially New Testament where they were going and this and that. But now we have DNA showing us how these things also connect. It says these have been tolerated by the popes during their residence there, and probably no great notice had been taken of them since the removal of the papal court. Again, the church had been taken out of Spain. Again, after the conquest of Metz and Alsace, a considerable number of German Jews became subjects of France. It is likely that they by no means regretted the change of masters. For only a few years before, the Parliament at Metz had burnt a number of Jews on the old charge of murdering infants. Louis XIV granted the Jews of Alsace the same privileges possessed by Bordeaux and other cities, that of free commerce on condition of paying a certain poll tax, subsequently compounded for a lump sum. Nevertheless, all over Lorraine and Alsace, the Jews during this century were harshly dealt with. Their usurious exactions rendered them odious to the people, as indeed had been the case with their ancestors for many generations. In Strasbourg, a few Jewish families were allowed to reside. In Lorraine, the laws of Duke Leopold made in 1724 continued long in force. By these, only 180 families were permitted to reside and to carry on trade, and even these were required to live within the Jewish quarters. So, again, this was the 1700s. Slavery was in full effect. There were only a few Jewish families that were allowed to even reside in the territories of France. We see here that even those families who were allowed to stay and carry on trade still had to live in the ghettos. So I don't even think the ghettos in America are coincidence. You know, they give us documented history, or they give us this backstory through a documentary, but I think it all, again, follows us through history, and you have to be a student of history to find these things out. And me, myself, I'm not originally a history student. Originally, I could care less about history. History was the most boring subject to me when I was young. But in the last 10 years plus, because of information coming out and being able to find information, it's become one of the most interesting subjects that I could ever imagine. So when it comes to putting these puzzle pieces together, not just to be able to say, look what I found, but more so that we can look at our people and say, look, this is who we are. This is where we came from. Now let's heal that brokenness inside of us, because now we know where our foundation is. Now we can go back to being greatness. Now we can step in our positions as one people and again reach those heights where we need to go to become successful. But it says, when the edict of Nantes, remember Nantes. Nantes is very, very important. When the edict of Nantes was revoked, and all the subjects of the King of France were required to accept the ordinances of the Catholic Church, the Jews in France were in some danger of persecution. But the act seems never to have been carried out so far as they were concerned. As before, the clergy were too busy enforcing the law against the Huguenots to trouble themselves about the handful of Jews. So this Nantes edict, or the Edict of Nantes, although it was put into order, it didn't really affect the Jews because, again, the church was fighting against the reformers. It says, but though they were kindly treated, it would be a mistake to suppose that they were naturalized, as some writers have affirmed. It is said that they offered the regent Orleans 2 million livres in exchange for the privilege of naturalization, meaning they weren't citizens. They couldn't be citizens, and they were trying to pay for citizenship. A sum which that impecunious potentate would have been well pleased to lay his hands on, but he was afraid of the unpopularity he would incur by the act and refused to offer. So even though they were offering to pay such a large sum of money, he refused to take it because he didn't want to be looked at in a negative light. It says, the writer of the pamphlet respecting the Naturalization Bill of 1753, quoted in a previous chapter, says, it is a vulgar error to suppose that the Jews in France were naturalized subjects, and any Frenchman of whom you ask the question would laugh in your face. It appears to have been only in certain cities that the Jews were allowed to reside permanently. In Lyons, they could only reside 3 months consecutively. In Paris, it is said their residence was altogether prohibited. So again, not only were they not naturalized, they couldn't live in places for an extended period of time. So that's why we don't have a historical account of black families, quote unquote, being a part of the natural landscape, because they had to continuously move. Plus, like I said, slavery was in full effect at this time. It said Louis XV appears to have treated them with kindness and to have discouraged the step which was made to abridge their privileges. He also showed much favor to the celebrated Samuel Bernard, the famous banker of his day, who afterwards became a convert to the church. As the century advanced, Voltaire and the encyclopedists began to exercise a wide influence in France. It might have been expected that they would have exerted it in favor of the Jews, who, although they were no longer exposed to the terrible sufferings they had undergone in previous generations, were still subject to a more modified religious persecution, a thing utterly abhorrent to the writers in question. So now comes the encyclopedists. And if I'm not mistaken, the encyclopedists, they were that day's far leftists. They believed that everyone should be able to live however they wanted to live, doing whatever they wanted to do. And they were in charge of gathering information, compiling information to present to the church to show that there was more to life than the church. And I'm just pretty much trying to paraphrase without getting too bogged down. That might be something we can look into together later. But let's see, where did I leave off at? Okay, so it says, but the encyclopedists, although they were far leftists, disliked the Jews almost as much as the Christians. The Hebrew race has suffered cruelly in previous ages as being the enemies of the gospel. But in the eyes of the infidel writers, they were almost as objectionable as being the living witnesses of this truth. No Dominican prosecutor of the 15th century would have viewed the Jews with more contempt and hatred than does Voltaire, the advocate of religious tolerance. So again, Voltaire, although he believed and he was an advocate of religious tolerance, he was an advocate of accepting people for what they believed in. He hated the Jews more than the Dominican persecutors of the 1400s. That's a crazy statement to make. He hated the Jews more than the people who exiled the Jews from Spain and Portugal in the 1400s. That's a crazy thought. So to be, we have a lot of people who complain today about how the Democrats hate the Democrats hate black people, and that that's why they don't pass a whole lot of things to really help us, and that the Republicans and all this. But we see that there's nothing new under the sun. The scripture tells us there is nothing new under the sun. The same thing that was happening back then is happening today. The same thing that we see happening right now are the same things that happened back then. It says, in fact, it is obvious that the Jews had to undergo many hardships in France during the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV. Which Louis was in charge of, was the one that was reigning when Louisiana was established in America? Let me see. Let me go and check something real quick. When was I'm talking to AI. Google AI. When was Louisiana established? And who was the king? It says Louisiana was established as a French territory on April 9th, 1682, when explorer René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle claimed the region. It was named in honor of King Louis XIV. So it was named in honor of King Louis XIV. So we got it right here on the screen. It says, in fact, it is obvious that the Jews had to undergo many hardships in France during the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV. A few years after the accession of Louis XVI, the mildness of whose temper had become generally known, a petition was presented by the Jews to the king and council, complaining of the heavy burdens laid upon them. Besides the fees exacted for the royal protection, a capitation tax was imposed upon them by the feudal superior on whose estate they resided. The right of residence was only personal, and a fresh sum had to be paid for every child that was born to them. Further, a toll was paid by every Jew at the gate of every city which he entered, as though he had been a horse or a sheep. There were besides restrictions on their commerce which weighed heavily upon them. Now remember this section, because the footnote after this is going to be very telling about this time period. I'm going to read it again. Further, a toll was paid by every Jew at the gate of every city which he entered, as though he had been a horse or a sheep. There were besides restrictions on their commerce which weighed heavily upon them. The appeal to Louis XVI was not in vain. The obnoxious capitation tax was abolished in 1784, and in 1788, commissions was appointed, of which Malesherbes was the president, and the first act of the latter was to put an end to the toll at the city gates. Malesherbes also set on foot measures for ameliorating generally the condition of the Jews. He proposed to give a prize for the best essay on the subject. This was gained by the celebrated Abbe Gregory, whose essay was very generally approved. Steps were taken to carry out some of the improvements suggested. But before this could be done, the revolution had begun, and liberty, equality, and fraternity for all men had become the general cry in France. Let me read that again. But before this could be done, the revolution had begun. Liberty, equality, and fraternity for all men had become the general cry in France. The Jews were not slow to avail themselves of their opportunity and sent in their petition to the General Assembly to be admitted to the rights of equal citizenship. The question was discussed in the National Assembly and was affirmed, though not until considerable debate. On the 17th of September, 1791, the decree was passed by which the Jews, without exception of distinction, were admitted to the rights of French citizenship. It was ratified also by the Constitution of 1795. Now I'm going to come back to that real quick, but I want you to look at this tariff that we read about earlier. It says the tariff of tolls has been preserved and has a curious sound. For a Jew, a male Jew, 12 deniers, about 1D, I don't know what that increment is. It says the tariff for a Jewess and a child, 9 deniers. For a Jewess, 6 deniers. So a mother and her child, 9 deniers. A mother or a female Jew, 6 deniers. For a dead Jew, 5 sows. A dead Jewess, 30 deniers. So this was again at the time when slavery was at its peak. They were bringing deceased Jews. They were bringing in Jewish male slaves. They were bringing in female Jews with their children, and they were bringing in young Jewish women into the cities in France, and they had to pay a tax or a tariff for everybody, whether it was breathing or not. But let's go back up real quick. It says on the 17th of September 1791, the decree was passed by which Jews without exception or distinction were admitted to the rights of French citizenship. It was ratified also by the Constitution of 1795. Can somebody tell me when slavery first became abolished in France? When did the French begin preaching for the abolition of slavery? Let's ask AI. When did France abolish slavery? When did France abolish slavery? It says France permanently abolished slavery in its colonies April 27th, 1848 under the Second Republic. But it says the country's path to abolition occurred in multiple stages. 1315, King Louis X banned slavery within metropolitan France. 1794, the French National Convention first abolished slavery in its colonial territories. That is in between this September 1791 date, when the Jews were allowed to be citizens in France, because there was a renaissance of sorts. There was this thing happening in France where people were beginning to be enlightened, and they believed that there should be fairness, justice, and equality for all people. And in 1791, they passed a decree that the Jews could be admitted to the rights of French citizenship, and it was ratified by the Constitution in 1795. It was ratified in 1795 because abolition happened in 1794. That's important. Again, this is bringing all of this together. And I know it's taken me a long time, but it's bringing all of this together. And I'm going to try to be done here real soon. I didn't mean to put a documentary together, but I believe that, like I said earlier, this Nolan Wells case has given us something to really look into. Not because it's the only case, but because we're seeing something. For some reason, this is staying in the public eye for a long time, when usually they just sweep these things under the rug. But in this case, they can't sweep Mr. Wells under the rug. So we've talked about the Jews in France all the way, well, beginning in the 1100s, all the way up now to the 1800s. So what is the big deal? Why in the world did I want to go through all of that and do all of that reading and take so much time for us to get to the main point? Because I like to build. I want to call it a case because I'm not an investigator. I'm just somebody who likes to put puzzles together, to try to figure things out. My profession, my previous work was AML associate. So, putting the pieces of the puzzle together, trying to find how things go together. I'm also a minister, so reading and studying and all that stuff. So this is intriguing to me, and I want to build a full picture instead of just giving you bits and pieces. But anyway, let's not get lost in the sauce. So what we see here on the screen, it says France and the Jew relations. So we just read through all of the relations with France. And at one point we read that there had been this uprising that was led by an apostate Hungarian monk who had originally been a Muslim. The avowed purpose was to rescue of King Louis from the hands of his enemies. They committed pillage and murder wherever they went, but the Jews were the special objects of their violence. Now, this isn't that monk from that story. I just pulled this picture because I wanted to show you what a monk looked like in the 13th century. I wanted you to see the way they dressed. I wanted you to see how their appearance looked. Now, this is uncanny, I think, and I promise I'm not making fun of, I'm not trying to start something, but I wanted to just draw us to a line here, because I took that exact same monk and put it in the AI, and I asked AI to change his robe to a hoodie, to change his to put a trucker hat on and put him on some shades. And this gentleman looks just like someone that we would see who calls themselves a redneck. Not somebody we would call a redneck, but someone that would call themselves a redneck. I think I saw on one video they call them the sunglasses gang or something like that, because they always have the same look. But these are the same people who are always touting to be Christians and devout Christians, and they're always the type to be online talking about chimping out and don't be chimping out and the usual suspect and this, that, and the third. But I just always want to draw the line to show that there's really nothing new under the sun. There's never anything new under the sun. Again, this is a monk from the 13th century. He looks just like somebody walking around in America today. It's not because he copied their style of dress. It's because people descend from their foreparents. People look just like the people they come from. So this isn't just a coincidence. But it goes deeper than that. It goes even deeper. It goes much, much deeper. Because we just read about everything that happened with the Jews in France. But we were never taught, at least I was never taught, that France was very active in the slave trade. France had a very firm footprint in slavery. Remember, I told you to remember that name Nantes? Remember the Edict of Nantes that they passed to combat the Huguenots, and the Jews kind of slid under the radar because they were fighting the Huguenots or the people who were reformists more than they were fighting the Jews. Nantes was a place where the Jews lived, but Nantes was also one of the ports where they took slaves out of. Now, it's documented, or it's said that Nantes deported a number of slaves. Now, I want to read this from their site here. I hope this doesn't slow down my connection. But let's go look at this real quick. Let's go look at this site real quick here. Is this? Yeah, there we go. Excuse me. Let me try to make this a little bit bigger so you can read it with me. It says, slave trade, the port of Nantes. It looks like it's trying to slow down on me. Let me close the book here. I'm going to close the book and we're going to see what we can do with this. If it's going to let me do anything. Here we go. All right, you did too much right there. Come back down. All right. So, slave trade, the port of Nantes. It says, Once the Portuguese made successful transatlantic trading voyages, other European nations quickly followed. In the 18th century, the port of Nantes became the busiest French port involved in the European slave trade to the Americas. It rivaled in importance the larger ports of Liverpool and Lisbon. It says over 1,500 vessels from Nantes sailed to the coast of Africa to trade European goods for African slaves. The ships would stop along the West African coast, trading until their holds were filled with human cargo. Ocean voyages lasted from 5 to 10 weeks. The Middle Passage, the long oceanic crossing from Africa to the Americas, was a scene of tragedy. Approximately 13% perished during the voyage, and attempts to revolt were bloody and usually unsuccessful. Most of the 400,000 Africans taken on Nantes slave ships were taken to the island of Saint Dominique, now known as Haiti. The ships were then loaded with valuable goods produced from the work of slaves, especially sugar. As with other slave trading ports in Europe, the economy of Nantes grew wealthy on the backbreaking work of slaves. So this writing just said that there were 1,500 ships from Nantes that went to the coast of Africa for slaves. Now, I think it's very telling that the people who persecuted the Jews would go and find just some other people to put into slavery when they knew exactly where the Jews who were not converting was going to and from. There's been a debate about the map that was a cartography of Emmanuel Bowen that shows the the kingdom of the Jews in the slave coast. Now, we have a lot of books. I've talked about it. What happened at Ouida, how they went in 700 miles into the inland to get slaves. That was to grab the people from around the Niger River to bring them back. And these voyages or these expeditions took weeks to go and get the people and bring them back. So we know, or we can assume, and I'm going to use the term assume. I know what my mom always told me, when you start assuming, you make an ass out of you and me. But in this case, because they try to mix things up in history, we can only assume. But it makes the most sense that the people that you're persecuting would be the people that you put into slavery, especially when you read that these people are under bondage within your territories and in your regions, and that they're being kicked out here and there. There's also a notation by Leo Africanus to show that, let me see if I can pull it up just so I can read it. I'm not going to try to pull it up on here because I don't want my computer to slow down, because I'm to be honest, I want to get us out of here. I don't want to keep us here too much longer. But let me see if I can find this here. Here we go. It says the present Christians in Africa. This is from let me go back. Let me give you the title of this book. The title of the book is Atlas Geographus, or A Complete System of Geography, Ancient and Modern for Africa. Volume number 4. It says what is of the most use in blue. I can't make all that out. It's very small print, but let's go back to this writing here. All right, here we go. It says, the presence of Christians in Africa are partly strangers and partly natives. Some of them slaves to the Turks and barbarians, and others free. Some of the Jews who inhabit both sides of the Niger, some of the Jews who inhabit both sides of the Niger, some of the Jews who inhabit both sides of the Niger derived themselves from Abraham. Others fled hither from Asia when Vespasian destroyed Jerusalem, or from Judea when 'twas wasted by the Romans, Persians, and Saracens and Christians. Some were banished from Italy in 1342, from Spain in 1462, from the Low Countries in 1350, from France in 1403, and from England in 1422. These all differ in habit and are divided into several wealthy and numerous tribes, but have no dominion, are despised of all nations, and so abominated by the Turks that they are not admitted to the Mohammedans unless first baptized and then made use of, only to receive their customs and gather in their taxes. So we have multiple accounts corroborating each other, telling us that there were Jews on the Niger, showing that France was going to a territory to get slaves who were going to the Niger to get slaves, showing that there were 400,000 taken into Haiti on these 1,500 slave ships from Nantes. This is something that we should all be paying attention to. And again, I am building something here. I'm trying to put this together, because I don't just want us to I don't just want us to feel like we're reaching here. I want you to see that we're putting all of this together. So when it comes to everything that we're seeing, it's evident that our foundations here in America are of a poignant, smelly, stale past. There's nothing new under the sun. So going back to our presentation here, this is one of the ships of Nantes. Now, I want to enlarge this if I can, because I think it's important for us to see that not everything, not all the accounts that we have of the slave trade is factual, because they told us that the slaves were savages. But when we look at these images, especially this particular image, we see that the slaves, or the prisoners in this case, are mingling. They're mingling with the people on board. They're mingling with the people on board this ship. And I'm moving a little slow here. Bear with me. We're gonna get out of here soon. I've been up here a long time, and it's a lot. It's a whole lot. All right. So let's look at this. Let's look at this image. Let's see what this image looks like here. So if you look, And I don't want to try to make it bigger because I don't want it to slow down. But if you look at the dark images, those are the slaves. They're talking to the people on board. They're actually having discussions with the folks on board the ship. Some of the folks who have on clothes are other black people. So there had to be something that allowed them to communicate. There had to be no barrier to communication. But let's continue. Let's continue here. So this map here, as you get, I have the web address where you can go and find this little map. This map it might look like something simple, but this is all the major slave ports of Europe. These are all the major slave ports of Europe. You have Cadiz, Lisbon, and Barcelona in Spain. You have Bordeaux and Nantes in France. You have Bristol, Liverpool, and London in England. And then you have Amsterdam in the Low Country or in the area of Holland. Now, you can go back on your own time and do a little bit of research in these territories and their I forget what I'm trying to say, but anyway, you can go back and you can look up these different territories and study them on your own to see what. But I did put a little something here together. So in Cadiz, which is the southernmost port of Europe, down there in Portugal, in Spain, the history of the Jews of Cadiz spans ancient trading routes, medieval prosperity under Christian and Muslim rule, the tragic expulsion of 1492, and a vital 20th century escape route during World War I. In Lisbon, the Jews had deep medieval roots. Give me a sec. Let me move this. Matter of fact, I'm going to take myself out the way here so that we can see. Let me get myself out the way. It says, Jewish Lisbon features deep medieval roots, tragic Inquisition history, and a resilient modern community. Key sites to explore include the Sher Tikva Synagogue on Rua Alexandria Herculano, the historic Alfama Jewish Quarter, Judiera Grande, and the 1506 Lisbon Massacre Memorial at Largo de São Domingos. This is Lisbon. Barcelona. See that on the eastern, northeastern tip of Spain. Barcelona has a rich Jewish history anchored by the medieval El Cal district, alongside a small modern community of roughly 3,500 to 6,000 residents. Notice they said a small modern community. So when they say modern, they're not talking about the Black Portuguese. We know what happened to the Black Portuguese. But we also know that in the 1700s, there was an influx of Ashkenazi Jews into the west of Europe. All right. Bordeaux, the most southern port in France. The Jews of Bordeaux have a rich history dating back to Roman and medieval times, growing significantly with the arrival of Sephardic Portuguese, new Christians, we just read about those, escaping the Inquisition in the 16th century. Nantes. The Jewish community of Nantes has a long, resilient history defined by medieval banishments, Sephardic trading routes, and a modern post-Holocaust revival. Key areas include the medieval Rue de la Juiverie settlement, 16th century Portuguese crypto Jews, and the 19th century establishment of the permanent community. So we had the Portuguese Jews in the 16th century, so the 1700s. We just read about the few families that got to stay in that area. And then the 19th century establishment of the permanent community, which we again know as the Ashkenazi Jews of today. All right. And London. The history of the Jews of London spans back to 1066, featuring major periods of settlement, including the medieval era, the 1656 resettlement under Oliver Cromwell, and the large Eastern European migration of the late 19th century. Bristol. The Jewish community in Bristol dates back to the medieval period around 1100, featuring historical landmarks like Jacob's Well Mikveh, the Park Row Synagogue, and active modern outreach through Chabad of Bristol. Liverpool. Liverpool has the oldest organized Jewish community in the north of England, established around 1745. Key milestones include building the Seal Street Synagogue in 1806, serving as a major immigration port for Eastern European Jews in the 1880s, and electing Charles Mosley as the city's first Jewish mayor in 1863. And finally, Amsterdam. Amsterdam has a rich 400-year Jewish history, anchored by the Jewish Cultural District, the 17th century Portuguese synagogue, and the Jewish Museum. It evolved from a vital sanctuary for persecuted Sephardic and Ashkenazi refugees into a cornerstone of European Jewish culture. Again, the most important thing about these territories here is the fact that these places, although having remarkable Jewish history, are also the most prominent European ports for the transatlantic slavery. Think about that. Transatlantic slavery goes perfectly on top of these ports of Europe where there were large, remarkable Jewish histories. So, with that said, when it comes back to our young brother, Mr. Nolan Wells, and I went a long way around just to get back to this. We know that you learn everything from your father. Your father learned everything from his father. His father learned everything from his grandfather, so on and so forth. If the people who established these territories of Louisiana that were broken up to include Mississippi here, we know that the history proves out that there is no regard for black bodies. They don't care that anything happens to hold anybody responsible for the plundering of a black life. So it's no coincidence that although what happened to Nolan may not have been purposely done, it may not have been racism on the front end, but on the back end, we're seeing what appears to be a racism that's ingrained so deeply into a community that not even they probably know where it comes from. So foundation is everything. Foundation is the only thing that we can stand on. So when it comes to Nolan Wells, when it comes to the things that this young man's family, his friends, his loved ones, the black community as a whole, everything that we've seen and endured, when we see another black body lose life and nobody has the answer for it, we just look back in history. We read that there were laws passed, not just people acting rogue. There were laws passed. Laws were passed that said that not only could they kill Jews, but nobody had to answer to those murders. Nobody had to even be brought to court for those murders. So if it's foundational, I don't think it's coincidence that we're seeing these people go through so many lengths to make sure that nothing comes out, that they're trying to brush everything under the rug, that they're calling everything that we see a non sequitur. The video that the young lady posted that shows, or that where you can hear what sounds like in the background the commission of a crime, or the admittance of the commission of a crime, not by just one person, but by multiple people. The way things are being swept under the rug, it goes back along a historical line. Excuse me. I don't know if you're familiar with Benaiah Israel, but when I was preparing for my video yesterday, he dropped the video, and at the end of his video, he discussed the history of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. And he went through all the links or he read through some of the links that the Ku Klux Klan went through when preparing for Martin Luther King to come to town. And guess what? The same things that they put into their rights of protecting God and being great Christians and protecting the church from its enemies is the same thing that we read about in these books. The same thing that they're showing in these historical accounts. So it's not a coincidence. I mean, it's almost like the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, the Nolan Wells case shines a bright light on the foundation of this nation. When we get to looking into,
we do want to continue on with some of our top stories that we're following from this week. Taking you out to this, we have an update in a case that is really capturing attention all across the country. We do know that as of this,
everything that we are seeing, it may be very well that his friends were fond of him. It could be that maybe they were horsing around and he slipped and fell. Maybe he was being uncharacteristically annoying, and tempers flared. The reality is that it doesn't matter. The truth is that they are suppressing the happenings because it's going to be, it's not going to fare well for the image and the freedom of this friend group and their criminal accessories. And of course, I'm just speculating. I do know that when racism is the foundation and the system has been established for centuries, people tend to do the things their fathers did. It was a no-brainer to ignore the death of blacks in Europe, even when it was done on purpose. In this case, racism is potentially the reason why so many black and brown have met their demise and have it swept under the rug as a suicide or accidental death. Racism is the foundation of America. And it's one thing to believe that racism and white supremacy is a purely and poorly established ideology that poisons the minds of those seemingly cowardice stewards of hatred. But when we dare to take a look back into history, we find that the hatred that permeates the foundations of what is touted to be the greatest nation in the world has a religious founding. Once believed to be nobodies in the landscape, we find that not only are we not just nobodies, we are their society's nobody culture. We are the lot that they turned into their sworn enemies by declaring us the enemies of Christ. The most liberating part of oppression and enslavement is in the knowing who you are and the greatness that you possess. Not only have we always been great in this nation, we have always been great since they've known us. There's no wonder that they want to keep us underfoot. To the parents and loved ones of Nolan Wells and all those who have lost their lives in this great America and have yet to receive the justice they're due, I send my condolences. Although all I'm doing is providing information, I pray that this information is a small bit of insight that encourages us to fight on, because there's retribution on the horizon. Those who swear we are the enemies and the biggest threat to society have heaped coals on their own heads and are one day going to have to answer, not to us, but to the one who they claim they are fighting for. The Almighty hears all and he sees all, and in the end, he will fight for us. I thank you all for tuning in to the Ready Brew. Before I go, though, I just want to make a small plea. Please share this video. Share any video that comes across your feed, whether it's a long video like this one, whether it's an excerpt from this video or others. Even if it's only a YouTube short, share, like, because I'm 20 subscribers away from 500. And once we reach 500, the option to hype the video will come online. And with a hype, we can get this information out to people who the message usually doesn't reach. So like, subscribe if you want, if you will. Encourage others to subscribe, because as you can see, this is information that we're putting together to show facts and not just meme culture. We're not just memeing. This is a place where we're trying to show where all of us come together, not just black people, but black, white, Chinese, Middle Eastern, whatever. So the more this information gets out, the more we can have the real conversations about it. So please share, like, subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. If you stayed to the end, if you picked your way through, if you gave up altogether and you just skipped to the end, if you gave any of your time to my going on with me figuring out how this thing is working, from the bottom of my heart, I say thank you. I appreciate your support. I appreciate all of the encouragement for others to support. Again, this is about getting information out. I mean, of course, subscribers help with that. But my goal is not to rack up 100 million subscribers just for what can come out of it for myself. My goal is to put us out there so that we can begin healing us and getting ourselves back together. But in the meantime, thank you again for tuning in here at The Ready Brew. I'm grateful for you. Peace.
Welcome to The Ready Brew. This is the place you need to be. Here at The Ready Brew, I know just what you need to see. Bible, forensics, history, and DNA pulls all the pieces together, reviving the story and bringing the facts, unveiling what they thought was buried forever. Pull up a chair, grab yourself a cup. You know I wanna talk about it. Let's go.